The heat of an August morning clung to the small town of Blue Ridge, nestled in the rolling hills of North Carolina. Its charm was undeniable, with brick-lined streets and an old clock tower standing as a silent witness to decades of history. But beneath the town's picturesque surface, something insidious lurked, a deep rot in the heart of its police department. Richard Nelson, the newly appointed police chief, knew this all too well. His arrival wasn't the result of accolades or ceremonial fanfare. It was a mission, a fight against a culture of misconduct and prejudice that had festered for years. Standing in the precinct's parking lot, dressed in scuffed sneakers, a plaid shirt, and a weathered baseball cap, he looked more like a passerby than a man who had dedicated 2 decades to law enforcement. That was the point. "One look, and they'll size me up," Richard muttered to himself, tugging the brim of his cap lower. "But that's exactly what I need to see, the real faces behind the badges." The precinct loomed ahead, its grey facade reflecting the sunlight. Inside, it buzzed with the usual rhythm of a Tuesday morning, hurried footsteps, ringing phones, and bursts of laughter. But Richard didn't come for the noise. He came to hear the silence between the words, the unspoken truths of a broken system. His heart was heavy with the weight of his task. As a black man stepping into a leadership role in a department marred by whispers of racial bias and corruption, he was no stranger to the resistance awaiting him. But nothing could prepare him for the ugliness he was about to face, starting with Officer Daniels. Richard stepped into the precinct through a side entrance, the fluorescent lights casting a sterile glow on the tiled floors. He moved deliberately, taking in every detail, the clicks of officers leaning against desks, the offhand jokes that skirted the line of decency, the way some eyes flickered to him, sizing him up, then dismissing him just as quickly. "Hey, you!" The sharp voice cut through the hum of the room. Richard turned to see a tall, broad-shouldered officer striding toward him. His badge read, "Officer Daniels." The man's smirk oozed condescension. Behind him, a few officers leaned against the wall, their eyes gleaming with anticipation. "You lost?" Daniels sneered, stopping a few feet from Richard. "This isn't a shelter. Take your mess somewhere else." The words hit like a slap, but Richard stood his ground. "I'm here for—" Daniels raised a hand, cutting him off. "I didn't ask. I told you. Get out." A ripple of laughter rose from the onlookers. Richard could feel his pulse quicken, but his expression remained calm, unreadable. "I don't think you understand," Richard began, his voice steady. "Oh, I understand plenty," Daniels interrupted, stepping closer. His voice grew louder, carrying across the room. "We don't need people like you hanging around. You're just another piece of trash we have to clean up." The room erupted in laughter. One officer slapped his knee, while another shook his head in mock pity. Richard clenched his jaw. Every fiber of his being screamed to respond, to unleash the authority he carried. But he held back. Not yet. Then it happened. Daniels leaned in, his face inches from Richard's, and spit. The warm saliva struck Richard's cheek, sliding down as the room seemed to freeze. For a moment, all he could hear was the pounding of his own heartbeat. "Now," Daniels said, his smirk widening. "Are you going to walk out, or do I have to throw you out?" Richard didn't flinch. Slowly, he reached into his pocket, pulling out a handkerchief. The room watched in stunned silence as he wiped his cheek, his movements calm and deliberate. "Is this how you treat everyone who walks through these doors?" Richard asked, his voice measured but piercing. Daniels chuckled. "Only the ones who don't belong here." The laughter resumed, but this time it was strained, uneasy. Without another word, Richard turned on his heel and walked down the hallway. The officer's laughter faded behind him, replaced by an uneasy murmur. In his pocket, his hand clenched into a fist around the keys to his car. As he approached the precinct's main office, an intercom crackled to life. "All personnel to the briefing room immediately," a voice announced. Richard exhaled deeply. The time for silence was over. The real work was about to begin. The briefing room buzzed with casual chatter as officers filed in, some holding coffee mugs, others leaning against the walls in small clusters. Richard slipped in through a side door, unnoticed at first. He now carried a folder stamped with the precinct's official seal, the symbol of authority and accountability. At the front of the room stood Captain Harris, a stout man with a greying moustache who carried himself with an air of no-nonsense leadership. He tapped the podium for attention, clearing his throat. "All right, everyone. Settle down. We've got something important this morning." The room quieted as curiosity rippled through the crowd. Officer Daniels lounged against a wall, his arms crossed, his smug grin still firmly in place. Whatever amusement he'd taken from earlier, he wore it openly now, seemingly unaware of the storm about to descend. Captain Harris adjusted his glasses. "As most of you know, Chief Caldwell retired last month. Today I'm pleased to introduce his replacement, someone with an exceptional record and a clear vision for this department." The door opened wider, and Richard stepped forward. His footsteps were measured, his gaze sweeping the room with quiet authority. For a moment, silence blanketed the space as the officers took him in. Then recognition dawned on Daniels. His smirk faltered, replaced by a pale, stunned expression. Richard reached the podium, placed his folder down deliberately, and faced the room. His voice was calm but firm as he began. "Good morning. My name is Richard Nelson, and as of today I am your new Chief of Police." The silence deepened, the weight of his words settling like a stone in the room. Daniel's face turned crimson, beads of sweat forming on his brow. Richard continued, his voice steady and piercing. "This morning, I came in plain clothes because I wanted to see this department as it truly is, not through polished introductions but unfiltered." He paused, letting the tension build. "What I witnessed was eye-opening. Behaviors that are not just unprofessional but downright unacceptable." A murmur rippled through the room, but Richard raised his hand. "Quiet." The single word cut through the noise. He stepped closer to the edge of the podium, his gaze locking onto Daniels for a brief but deliberate moment before scanning the rest of the room. "Respect is not optional. It's the foundation of everything we do. Without it, we fail. Not just each other, but the community we've sworn to serve." Daniels shifted uncomfortably, his bravado from earlier evaporating under the weight of Richard's words. "This morning," Richard said, his tone sharp, "some of you laughed at what you thought was a powerless man being put in his place. Let me be clear, every individual who walks through those doors deserves dignity and respect, whether they're wearing a badge or not." His words sliced through the air like a blade. Daniel's shoulders sagged slightly as the room remained frozen. Richard allowed the silence to linger before continuing. "Let me also make one thing abundantly clear. The culture that has been allowed to fester here ends today." The officers watched as Richard stepped down from the podium, his presence commanding every inch of the room. He walked deliberately toward Daniels, stopping just a few feet away. "Officer Daniels," Richard said, his voice low but laced with authority, "you represent everything that's broken in this department." Daniels stammered, "Chief, I didn't know." "That's exactly the problem," Richard interrupted, his tone unyielding. "You didn't care to know. You didn't take a moment to think before you acted, because you assumed the man in front of you didn't matter." The room was suffocatingly quiet. Daniel's face burned red as he stared at the floor. "This isn't just about you," Richard continued, turning to address the rest of the officers. "It's about a culture where bullying and prejudice are tolerated, celebrated even. That stops now." He returned to the podium and opened his folder, pulling out a single document. "Effective immediately, Officer Daniels is suspended, pending a full internal investigation. Let this be a warning. This is the first of many changes." A collective gasp echoed through the room. Daniel's jaw tightened as he avoided the wide-eyed stares of his peers. "This isn't about punishment," Richard said, his voice firm but measured. "It's about setting a standard. If you're not willing to rise to it, this isn't the place for you." He scanned the room, locking eyes with each officer. Some looked away in discomfort, while others seemed to straighten under his gaze. "If you're ready to do better, to be better, then we'll move forward together," Richard said. "But know this, I will hold each of you accountable every step of the way." The meeting ended in heavy silence. Officers shuffled out without their usual banter, their expressions a mix of guilt and unease. Daniels stormed out last, his face a mask of anger and humiliation. Back in his office, Richard sat at his desk, exhaling deeply. He knew this was just the beginning. The road ahead would be long and grueling, but he hadn't taken this job to make friends. He'd come to make a difference. The phone rang, breaking his thoughts. It was Captain Harris. "Chief, I just wanted to say, you handled that better than most would have," Harris said, his voice cautious but sincere. "Thanks," Richard replied, his tone calm but resolute. "But the real work starts now. I need a full review of Daniel's record on my desk by tomorrow. Complaints, incident reports, everything." "You've got it, Chief," Harris said after a pause. "And I think you shook a few of them today, in a good way." Richard hung up, leaning back in his chair. Outside, the precinct halls were unusually quiet. It was a small victory, but he knew battles lay ahead. Change was never easy, but it was necessary, and Richard Nelson was ready for the fight. Not everyone was as willing to adapt as Reyes. By the end of the week, murmurs of dissent grew louder. Richard's decision to suspend Daniels was met with mixed reactions. While some officers viewed it as a much-needed wake-up call, others saw it as an attack on their camaraderie. Daniels, refusing to go quietly, filed an appeal against his suspension. His claim? Unfair treatment and a lack of due process. The appeal didn't surprise Richard. He'd seen it before. What mattered was how he handled it. During the review process, Richard requested a full audit of Daniel's history. The results were damning. Complaints of excessive force, inappropriate comments, and a pattern of unchecked misconduct painted a grim picture. The findings were brought before a disciplinary panel where Daniels sat with a defiant scowl. Richard was there too, his demeanor calm but resolute. "Officer Daniels," Richard began, addressing him directly, "your actions this week were not isolated incidents. They were part of a pattern that reflects poorly on you, this department, and the badge you wear." Daniels clenched his fists. "I've done nothing other officers haven't done before me," he snapped. "And that's the problem," Richard shot back, his voice sharp. "This department has tolerated misconduct for too long. That ends now." The panel upheld Richard's decision, denying Daniels' appeal and recommending termination. As Daniels stormed out of the room, his peers exchanged uneasy glances, the reality of the situation sinking in. Back at the precinct, the fallout was immediate. Officers who had once rallied behind Daniels now distanced themselves. Whispers of his suspension and the evidence against him spread like wildfire, serving as a stark reminder of Richard's zero-tolerance stance. But the resistance wasn't confined to Daniels. In closed-door meetings and quiet corners, some officers expressed their frustration, questioning Richard's methods. One evening, Captain Harris approached Richard. "Chief, there's been some pushback. A few officers feel like this is a purge." Richard exhaled slowly, leaning back in his chair. "It's not a purge, Captain. It's accountability. If they can't see the difference, maybe this isn't the place for them." Harris hesitated before nodding. "Understood. But just so you know, not everyone's against you. Some are starting to come around." Richard allowed himself a faint smile. "That's all I need. A few willing to lead by example. The rest will follow, or they'll fall away." The following weeks were a test of endurance. Richard held training sessions on implicit bias and community engagement, inviting outside experts to lead discussions. Attendance was mandatory, but engagement was optional, a fact that wasn't lost on Richard. One session in particular stood out. An officer raised his hand, his tone laced with skepticism. "Chief, how do you expect us to serve the community when they don't trust us?" Richard met his gaze evenly. "Trust isn't given, it's earned, and it starts with us. We can't demand respect if we don't show it first." The officer frowned but said nothing more. Others nodded subtly, their expressions thoughtful. Richard knew he wasn't going to change everyone overnight, but each small victory, a recruit speaking up, an officer reconsidering their actions, was a step in the right direction. By the end of the month, The precinct felt different. The laughter in the halls wasn't at someone's expense. It was genuine. Officers like Reyes took the lead in fostering a culture of respect, challenging the old norms. But for Richard, the work was far from over. Every day brought new challenges, new resistance. Yet with each passing week, the vision of a better department came closer to reality. Change was slow, but it was happening, and Richard was determined to see it through. For Richard, the greatest challenge wasn't inside the precinct walls. It was outside, in the community. Blue Ridge's residents had grown wary of law enforcement after years of neglect, prejudice, and abuse of power. The trust between the police and the people they served was shattered, replaced by a deep-seated resentment. Richard knew that rebuilding that trust would take more than policies and speeches. It would require visible, tangible change, and it would require listening. One Saturday morning, Richard attended a community event at a local park. Food trucks lined the sidewalks, children played on swings, and families lingered around picnic tables. But even amidst the cheerful atmosphere, there was tension. People eyed the officers present with skepticism, their smiles fading as Richard approached. A young boy, no older than 10, stood near a balloon vendor, clutching his father's hand. His wide eyes fixed on Richard's badge, curiosity and fear flickering across his face. "Hi there," Richard said, crouching to meet the boy's gaze. "What's your name?" The boy hesitated before whispering, "Evan." "Nice to meet you, Evan. I'm Chief Nelson," Richard said with a warm smile. Evan glanced at his father, who frowned but didn't stop the conversation. "My dad says the police don't care about us," the boy said quietly, his voice trembling. The words hit Richard like a punch to the gut. He took a deep breath, steadying himself. "I can't change what's happened in the past, Evan," he said gently. "But I promise you, I'm working to make things better. And if you ever need help, you can come find me. Okay?" Evan nodded slowly, a flicker of hope lighting his face. His father's expression softened as he watched the exchange, but the wariness in his eyes remained. As Richard stood, he scanned the crowd. He could feel the weight of their judgment, their cautious optimism tempered by years of disappointment. It was a start, but it wasn't enough. Back at the precinct, Richard doubled down on efforts to engage with the community. He organized forums where residents could voice their concerns directly to officers. He encouraged his team to participate in outreach programs, from food drives to school visits. Some officers embraced the change, while others dragged their feet. Officer Reyes, now one of Richard's most vocal supporters, often led the charge. Her willingness to connect with residents and acknowledge past mistakes became an example others began to follow. But not everyone was willing to adapt. A handful of officers resigned, unable or unwilling to meet Richard's standards. Each resignation was a reminder of the uphill battle he faced. But Richard didn't falter. "This isn't about numbers," he told Captain Harris during a staff meeting. "It's about integrity. I'd rather have 10 officers who believe in our mission than 100 who don't." Weeks turned into months, and slowly signs of progress emerged. Complaints against officers dropped. Community members began attending forums in greater numbers, their initial hostility giving way to cautious collaboration. But change didn't come without resistance. One day, a heated exchange erupted during a community meeting. A middle-aged woman named Mrs. Carter stood up, her voice trembling with anger. "My son was arrested last year for something he didn't even do," she said, her eyes brimming with tears. "He still has nightmares about how he was treated. What are you doing to make sure that doesn't happen to anyone else?" Richard stepped forward, meeting her gaze. "Mrs. Carter, I can't undo what your son went through, and I'm truly sorry for the pain it's caused your family. But I can promise you this. We're holding officers accountable. We're training them to do better, to be better. And we're listening, to you, to your son, to everyone in this community." Her expression softened slightly, though the pain in her eyes remained. "Words are easy, Chief. Prove it." "I intend to," Richard said firmly. The breakthrough came one crisp autumn morning. Richard had planned an open house at the precinct, inviting residents to tour the facilities, meet officers, and see firsthand the changes being implemented. The turnout exceeded expectations. Families walked through the halls, children sat in patrol cars, and officers, many of whom had once been symbols of fear, now shared smiles and laughter with the community. Near the end of the event, Evan's father approached Richard. His expression was unreadable, but he extended a hand. "Chief Nelson," he said, his voice steady, "I wasn't sure about you at first, but I can see you're trying. That means something." Richard shook his hand, a small but significant victory in his ongoing mission. That night, as Richard sat at his desk reviewing the day's events, Captain Harris knocked on the door. "Long day, Chief?" Harris asked with a smile. Richard chuckled. "A good one, though." Harris nodded. "You're making a difference, you know. People are noticing." Richard leaned back in his chair, the weight of the past months catching up with him. "It's a start, Harris, but there's still a long way to go." He gazed out the window, the lights of Blue Ridge twinkling in the distance. Change was never easy, and the road ahead was far from smooth. But for the first time, Richard felt something he hadn't in a long time. Hope. Change wasn't just possible, it was happening. And Richard was determined to see it through no matter the cost. Months turned into a year, and while the precinct was far from perfect, the changes Richard had implemented were undeniable. Officers who had once dismissed his vision now found themselves adapting, some reluctantly, others with genuine commitment. The community, once wary and distrustful, began to soften. Small moments, a wave from a shopkeeper, a parent thanking an officer for helping their child, spoke volumes about the progress being made. Richard maintained his routine of walking the precinct halls, a constant reminder of his leadership and expectations. One morning, he overheard a conversation between two officers in the break room. "You see Reyes out there last night?" one said. "She handled that call like a pro. Calm, respectful. The guy actually thanked her after she cuffed him." The other chuckled. "Who'd have thought we'd be hearing that in Blue Ridge?" Richard allowed himself a small smile as he walked away. Moments like these were proof that his efforts were taking hold. Despite the progress, Richard knew the fight wasn't over. Resistance still lingered, both within the precinct and the community. He remained vigilant, knowing that complacency could undo everything they had worked toward. One of the final tests came when a high-profile incident threatened to derail the progress. A young man from the community, arrested on suspicion of theft, claimed he was mistreated during his arrest. The accusation sparked outrage, with residents demanding accountability. Richard called an emergency meeting, his voice calm but resolute as he addressed his officers. "This is why accountability matters," he said. "We've made strides, but one misstep can undo it all. I've ordered a full review of the incident. If there was misconduct, there will be consequences. If there wasn't, we'll show the community we're committed to transparency." The investigation revealed that while the arresting officer had followed protocol, his approach lacked empathy and escalated the situation unnecessarily. Richard didn't shy away from the findings. At a community forum, he stood before a packed room, his tone measured but firm. "We made a mistake, not in enforcing the law, but in how we approached a member of this community. That's on us, and we'll do better." The honesty surprised many. While not everyone was satisfied, the gesture of transparency went a long way in reinforcing the trust Richard had worked so hard to rebuild. By the end of his first year, the precinct had transformed. Officers who couldn't adapt were gone, replaced by recruits who shared Richard's vision for fairness and respect. The laughter in the halls felt lighter, no longer tinged with cruelty or exclusion. One evening, Richard stood in the main hallway, watching as officers clocked out for the night. Reyes passed by, giving him a nod and a smile. Captain Harris lingered behind, his arms crossed, a rare look of approval on his face. "You've done it, Chief," Harris said. "This place isn't the same anymore." Richard shook his head slightly. "We're not done, Harris. Change doesn't stop, it's constant. But I'll take this as a good start." Outside, the lights of Blue Ridge twinkled against the darkening sky. The town still had its struggles, but the bridge between the precinct and its people was stronger now. As Richard locked up his office for the night, he allowed himself a rare moment of satisfaction. He thought back to the boy in the park, Evan, and his shy smile. Moments like that were the reason he'd taken this job, to make a difference, not just for the officers under his command, but for the community they served. Change was never easy, but Richard knew it was worth every fight. The precinct wasn't perfect, and neither was the town. But together, they were moving forward, one step at a time. And that, Richard thought as he stepped into the cool night air, was how real change began. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this powerful story and want to see more inspiring and thought-provoking content, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Turn on the notification bell so you'll never miss a single video. Let's keep spreading these important messages together. Your support makes all the difference.